Hi everyone, this is the sparse arrays problem by HackerRank. The link to this problem will be in the description. So this problem says that there is a collection of input strings and a collection of query strings. For each query string, determine how many times it occurs in the list of input strings. Return an array of the results. So this is our strings list. This is our queries. Our first query is AB, and that appears 2 times in our strings list. And then our second query is ABC, that appears 1 time in our strings list. And our third query is BC, that appears 0 times in our strings list. And that is the reason why we are returning the results 2, 1, and 0. It's always good to look at the constraints. Our constraints are that the size of the strings list can be anywhere from 1 to 1000. The size of the queries list can be anywhere from 1 to 1000. And the values in the strings list and queries, the length of those values can be anywhere from 1 to 20. So this is the overview of our solution. Step 1, we will initialize the queries count with hashmap. It might be called dictionary depending on which programming language you're using. Step 2, we're going to count the queries found in the strings array. In step 3, we're going to map the queries count to an array. So let's walk through this problem. Given S, our strings list, equals this array, and given our queries equals this array, the first thing we want to do is initialize queries count. So we're going to set all the queries count to 0. So even though this queries array has 4 elements, one of those elements appears twice. So our queries count only needs, because we're using a dictionary, it only needs 3 keys. Next up, we're going to count the queries found in the strings array. So first up is ABA. So we're going to increment our ABA count. Then BABA does not exist in our queries count, so we could skip over it. Then we have ABA again, so we increment that. And then we have XZXB, so we increment that. Our final step is to map the queries to an array. So here's our counts. We're going to take our first query in our queries list and get the count. So that's going to be 2. Then we're going to get our second query, that will be 1. Then our third query, that will be 0. And our last query is 2 again. And then we will return the counts. We return this counts. So that's it for this solution. Go ahead and pause the video, try to solve it on your own, and then we will solve it together. Alright, let's jump into the code. So the first thing we want to do is create a hash map, or a dictionary, of our queries count. And this is going to store the count of all our queries. So the key is going to be each unique query in the queries array. And our value is going to be the count of those queries found in the strings array. So let's go ahead and add all the queries to the hash map. We're going to say for each query in our queries list, we are going to add that to our queries count. And we are setting the initial value to 0. So this for loop is the same thing as writing for int I, which is our index. And while our index is less than our queries.size, add I, and we'll say let's get the query of our queries list at index I. So this for loop is the same as this one right here. It's just that this one looks a little nicer, so I'm going to be using this one. So now that we've initialized our queries count, the next thing we want to do is loop through all of the strings. We're going to say for string in our strings array. Let's get the current count of that string in our queries count. Okay, so this returns the current count of this string found in our queries count. Right, so there's one thing though. Sometimes this string is not going to be in our queries. So when that happens, this queries count is going to return null. If the value is null, then there's nothing we need to do. But if the value does exist, so if it's not null, then we need to increment our queries count. So we're going to say counts plus plus. So that means if this string is a query, then we're going to increment that count. The last thing we want to do is convert this to an array list. So we're going to say our results equals a new array list. And we don't have to, but we're going to initialize the size, and it's going to be the size of our queries list. Then we will loop through our query array one more time and get each query inside of that. And we will say, let's add the queries counts of that query. Then we can return the results. Okay, so that completes the solution. Let's go ahead and paste it into HackerRank. And submit the code. So it says there's an error here at for string of strings. So it cannot resolve simple. So let's take a look at that real quick. Sorry, so this is using the word string list, not strings. So let me just change that real fast. And I think that's the only place it needs to be changed. There we go. So if you're unclear of what happened there, this is the wrong name for the parameter. It's called strings list, which causes this to not be recognized. So I had to update this to strings list as well. So that's it for the solution. Go ahead and try to solve for the time complexity and space complexity of this problem. So time complexity is asking, is there any sort of relationship between our input and how long it takes to run our code? And for this, let's go ahead and just go through the code and find out. So right here, it's not affected by our input. This is gonna be the same number of times. Right here, we have a for loop that is affected by our input. This is gonna loop through O of Q times, where Q is the size of our queries array. Then we have another for loop, and this loops through O of S times, where S is the size of our string list array. And this is not affected by our input, right? This is always going to happen regardless of what our input is. And then we have another for loop. This is affected by our input, right? It's going to loop through O of Q times, where Q is the size of our queries array. So let's add these all together. And we get O of Q plus S plus Q. And we can simplify, oh, 1 second, where S equals our string list size and Q equals our query size. We can simplify this though to be O of 2Q plus S. And when we do big O notation, we drop constants. So it's going to be O of Q plus S. That's it for our time complexity. Now let's calculate our space complexity. So right here, we're initializing a queries count variable. This is a hash map. And we're adding to this hash map all elements of our queries. So this right here, it's going to be O of, let's say Q, right? Where Q equals our query's size. Because for every query, we have to save that to our hash map. And let's go through our code. So we have a for loop, we have a count. This is O of 1. It's just one time. Doesn't matter what our input is. And we have our queries, and we're not adding anything here. We're just updating values. So this can be left alone. Then we have an array list, and we're initializing it to be the size of our queries, right? And we're adding all of our query. For every query, we are adding to this array list. So this is also going to be O of Q, where Q equals our query's size. So let's add this all up. And we have O of Q plus Q, which we can simplify to O2Q. And in big O notation, we can drop the constants. So it's going to be O of Q, where Q equals our query size. And that's it for this solution. Just want to say thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions or feedback, please let me know in the comments. Thank you.